remember, I guess it was during Kennedy's hearing, his congressional confirmation hearing, where all these Republican senators were telling him, I agree with you 100% on food, but I have this problem about vaccinations. And it's kind of, and that was stunning to see. I have not seen that in my time. In my time, those senators use industry talking points. We have the safest food supply in the world, the cheapest food supply in the world. And they all seem to abandon that. And that was amazing to see. But then that same crew of people, they go and pass the great big beautiful bill, which doubles down on the worst kind of agriculture.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic label, distinguishing crops grown in healthy soil and animals raised on pasture without synthetic fertilizers or toxic chemicals. You just heard from investigative journalist and food systems author Tom Philpott, whose reporting has exposed the political, economic, and environmental forces shaping the food system. His book, Perilous Bounty, blew me away. The subtitle is called The Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It. And the book covers what the government is currently incentivizing and how that is leading to devastating environmental consequences and extreme vulnerability in our nation's food supply. Tom joined us last summer to talk about the late Joan Gussow, whose work helped redefine nutrition and agriculture as one interconnected field. Tom also shared his thoughts on today's green revolution and holes in the arguments that justify harmful chemicals to prop up yields.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I am talking today to Tom Philpott. Tom, I've been trying to interview you for a long time, so I'm glad we finally got here.
I'm very happy to be here finally.
Yeah, Austin Farrick said, "Oh no, keep trying, Dave. He wants to talk to you." So here we are. And I called you this time because I wanted to talk about Joan Gussow. We're putting together a thing for Joan. And I saw you listed in the people who'd posted about Joan on the memoriam page. So did you know Joan?
I did know Joan. I met her at multiple conferences over the years. And I think the first time I met her, it would have been late 2000s, like 2008, 2009, somewhere in there at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. At that time, they would do these annual food sustainability meetings. And I just remember being very nervous to meet her, and a mutual friend, probably Naomi Starkman, if I had to guess, wanted to introduce me to her. And it was just sort of that, beautiful, warm Northern California sun. And she was just like, just such a beautiful person. And she just sort of radiated this love of the earth, of the land, of people. And I have to say, so I had been at this point writing for a few years about this topic, the topic of agriculture and food in the United States. And it was an incredible honor to hear her say that she read my work, appreciated it, and had even assigned it in classes. I was just, taken aback to have that affirmation from her. And when I first became aware of her was about a decade before I ever got into writing about food and ag. I was a financial journalist in New York City in the late 90s. And at this time, I was living in Brooklyn, and I got involved with the community gardening movement. My now wife worked at Green Thumb, which was the sort of city organization that oversaw the community gardens. And at that time, they were under attack from Rudy Giuliani, of all people. And so I kind of met a bunch of people in the community garden movement. And the name Joan Gussow was just a name that you heard bandied about, and her writings were passed around. This is really early internet. But yeah, so I read some of her work and became aware of her, and I'm pretty sure I saw her speak at some event at that time. She was just a tireless champion of the gardens, and that's how I sort of first became aware of her, and then met her about a decade later, and then would see her from time to time at New York City events or other sustainable farming events.
Yeah, I was really lucky to meet Joan through Elliot Coleman, a mutual friend, and I did my first interview with her in the height of COVID, and so it was all virtual. But she was fantastic, and in so many ways, did her work change you? The things that you read and heard from her, were there new ideas in here, or was it just hearing somebody saying out loud?
Well, I think the thing with Joan Gussow is that she's one of those thinkers who was so early to the game and so seminal that by the time I started to really get into this work, she already had so much influence that I think I basically absorbed her by osmosis by the time I had met her. And what I mean by that is, when you look back at her career now, she was a nutritionist. She was a professional nutritionist working in a nutrition school, in the 70s and 80s. And at that time, this was a profession that was very, hyper focused. It didn't look outside of what was on the plate. It partook of what would later be called, and she didn't coin this phrase, but she basically developed these ideas, what would later be called nutritionism. And that was basically the idea that, as long as you ate a certain number of calories, and so you didn't overeat, and you took in, 100% of the RDA of various, pre-identified vitamins and minerals, then you had a healthy diet. And she was one of the people who really saw early on that this wasn't going to work, that this sort of idea was not making people healthy, that some of these foods, even if you consume them at levels that were, below, certain caloric thresholds, weren't healthy. And she broadens the lens of the nutrition profession from this very narrow focus on calories and a few micro and macronutrients, and she trains it and looks outside to agriculture. And she's sort of one of the people who brought, the Albert Howard insight that agriculture and human health are interconnected, and if we have unhealthy agriculture, we're going to have unhealthy people. And this it was a slow revolution in the nutritional field. And you talk to Marion Nestle, who is just a few years younger, and Marion Nestle cites a lecture she saw Joan Gussow give in the 70s on this topic, and it changed Marion Nestle's trajectory to become the sort of phenomenon that she became. And so that's one of the ways that her influence sort of trickled out. And then another one is that people like Michael Pollan and Eric Schlosser, they especially Michael Pollan, they read her work, they cited her, they were big fans of hers, and they kind of popularized her ideas. And I'm not throwing shade at Michael Pollan, but I'm just saying that like a lot of the ideas that he made really popular are ideas that he was influenced by Joan Gussow, and he would be the first one to say that. And so, I think that I don't know if her work directly changed me, but I can tell you that it indirectly did. She came up with some really important ideas at really crucial times that changed the conversation about food. And I think that speaks to her greater influence, that you don't have to have read Joan Gussow to have been influenced by her.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of people haven't read Joan who are influenced by her. It's interesting. Her first big book, The Feeding Web, isn't even in print anymore. I just borrowed a copy from Elliot. It's a big book, and when I get through the conference, I'm going to sit down and try and read it. Um,
Yeah, and one thing that we've seen happen over the past few years is a lot of those old texts that fell out of publication get published again and have renewed influence. Like I can think of the One Straw Revolution was really hard to get at one time in the United States. It found a new publisher. I think some of Sir Albert Howard's works went out of print in the U.S. and someone should do an edition of these early Joan Gussow works and get them back out there again.
yeah, yeah. I quoted, I think I was probably quoting Dan Barber saying that every time he thought he came up with a really great idea, he discovered that Joan had had it 5 years earlier.
Yeah,
And
if not
somebody
if
said,
not
no,
25.
or if not 25. And somebody said, no, you got that wrong. That was Marion Nestle. And I said, well, no, actually, I think it was Dan Barber. And actually, I looked, it was all of them. They all said this.
Oh yeah.
So she was leading a bunch of very influential thinkers in coming up with a new vision of what was going on that was at odds with the accepted wisdom of the time.
Yeah, and then by the time I come around in the 2000s, she was continuing to teach. I'm pretty sure at Columbia, but now she's by this point she's playing this new role as this sort of this gray eminence, but just this sort of like this personality that young people coming into the field and coming into this kind of consciousness that something is deeply wrong about our agriculture. When you get into that and you sort of start getting into it professionally, whether you become a journalist like me or whether you go to some NGO or some organic farming group or start farming yourself, and you start coming to conferences, her presence there was just sort of like you would meet her and talk to her and learn from her personally. And especially in New York City, I know dozens of people who had really, really close relationships with her and were mentored by her. And, she just like, she had a way of sort of encouraging you down this path and kind of a Johnny Appleseed kind of person to person kind of figure for this work that was really wonderful to watch play out. I mean, you go to a conference in that period, and there would always be a swarm of young people around her, and then one of the rituals of being in this work would be to go out to see her place, in upstate New York, and it was something that we talked about many times, and I just never made happen. But I hope that her garden continues, and I still hope to make it out there sometime.
Yeah, yeah. So Tom, you've talked about how much influence Joan has had, but influence for what? What's the architecture of Joan's ideas? What was it that she saw? And I know that she taught this amazing course for many years on nutritional ecology. What was the essence of that, or the foundations?
I think the foundation was that something was deeply wrong with the way that 95+% of the food that's consumed in the United States is grown, and and these problems go off in many different directions. There are environmental problems. There are ecological problems. There's preaching to the choir here, but water pollution, air pollution, soil erosion. That there is an overeating problem. I was talking earlier about how even with if you stayed within caloric bounds, this kind of food isn't healthy. Well, it's also designed to take you out of caloric bounds and to make you eat more and more. And we eat way more calories than we're supposed to. And that the problems with the way that we eat food, they go off in all these different directions. And she was someone who really wanted to make that clear that you had to have a broader lens than this is producing lots and lots of calories in this very efficient way. She wants to broaden the lens to take in ecology, to take in human health, and to drive home the point that this is all one big subject, and that if we want to be healthy and live in a healthy environment, then we have to change the way we grow food. Now, I think we could have a longer conversation about why it is that we seem to be stuck in a place where we're still getting 95% of our food from here. That's no fault of Joan's. I mean, she was out there just in every way she could from her perch at Columbia and upstate New York. She was out there, you know, making the point that this wasn't going to work. And I think that, the answer to the riddle of how little progress there's been, I mean, there's been plenty of progress, but also in a bigger picture, we're still in this paradigm. And I think it's corporate control of the food system, corporate power. And that is something that she never shied away from writing about or talking about. She always named it. She, I think there's a tendency in this field to be like, well, if I shop at the farmer's market and if I join a CSA and if I go to farm to table restaurants, then I'm doing all I can and everything's fine. And she rejected that idea. She wanted everyone to have access to healthy food and realized that one of the big impediments was all of the sort of corporate interest in the system that is working really, really hard to maintain the status quo. And she was just very clear about that. And that's something that I'll always appreciate about her.
Yeah. So this is such an interesting point where, people talk about, your plate is your garden and your fork is your pitchfork, and that you can make choices. You can make personal choices about what you're going to eat, what you're going to buy. And ultimately, if we all do that, the whole system is forced to change. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, it sounds like you have, I'm sure there's nothing bad about that, but there's some problems with that point of view. It's missing
Well, yeah.
something.
I mean, and I think Joan would agree with this, that it's very necessary, but not sufficient. That the momentum, the inertia of the system is so strong that individual choices, while they do matter and while they are important, and how you can eat a healthy diet in the society, because of the work of people like you and Elliot Coleman and farmers across the country, if you seek out these kind of alternative foods, which is, I just mean fresh fruits and vegetables that don't have a lot of poisons in them, whole grains, pasture grown meats, you can have a very healthy diet, and that's great. And that is way more true than it was 30 years ago. There's no question about that. But if we're gonna transform the whole thing and make that sort of the rule and not the exception, then and I feel like I'm just parroting Joan here. We have to have policy change because there are these corporations have huge influence over the lawmaking process, the sort of congressional legislative process, and the sort of laws and resources that come out of the federal government. Just completely enshrine these kinds of ultra processed foods. We see them infusing school lunches to this day. So I stand with Joan in that these personal choices are incredibly important. I've made them myself, and I've worked on a small farm. I still am very careful about where I get food. Luckily, I live in a very robust food system, sort of food shed here in Baltimore, Maryland, in the sort of mid-Atlantic region. There's lots and lots of great farming and food provision around here. But I stand with Joan in saying that this is necessary but not sufficient. That we have to change policy as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's important. So I'm going to ask you the question. I've asked a lot of people this question, and I'll use the publication of Joan's book, The Feeding Web, as a starting point. That was about 50 years ago that she wrote it. And in your opinion, has the food system gotten better or worse in those 50 years?
I think it's gotten better and worse. If you look at, one of the things that I've done in my career, almost to a fault, is look at the two most important, biggest growing regions in the United States, and that would be sort of California Central Valley and the Corn Belt. And in these areas, the intensification, the just, pesticide treadmill that you see in a place like the Corn Belt, where, I think I was just for an article looking at in the Corn Belt, there are something like 11 different herbicides that are used on at least 10% of soybean acres in Iowa in, this decade, like right now, as we're speaking. And this has intensified since 1975. In the Central Valley of California, there is aquifer drawdown that has been intense and excessive, and pollution of groundwater from agrochemicals in these areas are just tragic, and have gotten worse over the past 50 years. So in that way, the food system, is basically getting worse every day. On the other hand, there has also been this incredible movement of especially small and mid-scale farms. And it's now the case that you can go to any American city on a Saturday, almost 100% year round. Maybe some places in the extreme north, there isn't anything year round, and find a farmer's market. And even probably in the really cold cities, there's some indoor thing that's doing something, in the middle of the coldest season. And 50 years ago, we might have had the remnants of the old truck farming economy where there were something like farmers markets. I remember them growing up in Austin, Texas, in the 80s, like the sort of pre-farmers market truck farm situation. But those people were all under, the farmers who were supplying that were all under severe pressure from competition from the grocery store and the supermarket. And we've got this sort of revitalization, CSAs that Joan was a big fan of. They've absolutely exploded since that time, and there are new models being experimented with that are really interesting. And so in that case, if you have the resources and the knowledge, it is way more possible in 2025 than it was in 1975 to have a diverse, healthy diet from, with food that wasn't grown with a lot of chemicals. So I think we've taken some steps forward and we've gone some steps back, and it's really hard to sort of net it out. But the indicators I see, like soil erosion in the Corn Belt, water pollution in the Corn Belt, they're only getting worse. And we know where that food is going. It's the going to the supermarket. It's corn sweetener, industrial fats that are injected into ultra processed foods and things like that. So it's a real mixed bag, but there is undeniable progress with things like, local food economies that Joan championed, for the entire 50 years that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I wanted to just ask about, it seems to me that there was a period about maybe 10 years ago, eight to 10 years ago, where I saw a real upswing in major supermarket chains buying local organic food and putting it on their shelves. And to me, that looks like that's mostly disappeared. Are you
Yeah,
aware of that? Is that your
yeah,
experience?
yeah, sure, I sure was, and I would say I've observed similar things. I remember covering when I was at Mother Jones, the Walmart push to do something like that, and it always seemed a little half-hearted. And I've seen it with grocery store chains where I've lived, like in Austin, Texas, the HEB chains, and I think because it's one of those things that were brought to bear by consumer pressure. So that's a victory for people making choices and the sort of existing institutions having to respond to those choices. Like if you're running a supermarket chain, you want to be able to say locally grown, especially during the growing season, and have a little section that's like that. And that did it did contribute. As we know, and as Joan knew for sure, if you're going to have a robust local and regional food economies, you need mid-sized farms as well as small farms. You need both. And to be a proper diversified mid-sized farm, the farmers market and the CSA might not really fit what you're doing. You might have too much to sell into those markets, or maybe you have to go to 5 farmers markets, and that's stretching you really thin. So to have institutional buyers that can like a regional supermarket chain saying, we'll buy all the squash you have and we'll give you a decent price for it. That really can be a linchpin of a local and regional food system. And I think the problem was because it was based on consumer preference and that kind of thing. The chains, they could commit to it briefly, and then they could decide, yeah, this is great, but we're not making enough off of it. And we've seen that dramatically over the decades with Whole Foods and its policies. And the sort of thing, Whole Foods is always a very regionalized company that different regions would have different managers and making different decisions. And there was a time there when they were making a big effort to get local organic in, and then just anecdotally from also from reporting things I've written, but just talking to people, talking to farmers, their commitment, what they were able to do in terms of between we'll buy your stuff at a decent price that is fair to you versus we're happy to buy your stuff, but you have to beat this price that we're getting from California. You know, that kind of transition ended up just sort of cutting the legs out from under it. And I do think that it kind of flounders now. And what you get is I think what it's resolved down to is now every grocery chain does have an organic section, but it's not real organic. It's the sort of USDA organic model, and it's with exceptions dominated by stuff grown fairly industrially in California and shipped across the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that those commitments, I agree with you that they seemed a lot more robust a decade ago.
Yeah. Well, we hope we can bring them back. I think it's important that the small farm revolution is the greatest hope that we have, but those mid-scale farms and being able to go to the grocery stores where most people are still buying most of their food, it would be really nice to have more choices there so that people could get what
Yeah,
they want. Yeah.
yeah, and you see it, you see it sometimes and in some places. We have a chain regional here in the Mid Atlantic called MOMS, and I think MOM stands for Maryland Organic Market. And the one here in Baltimore, I have to say, they do a pretty good job of getting stuff in during the growing season, where it's from within 50 or 75 miles of Baltimore. Where when you shop there in the produce section, it's a whole different world from the Whole Foods. It's there is an effort to get really good quality stuff from around here.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Those small independent stores are certainly threatened. I mean, we want them to succeed, but uh, in the retail space, there seems to be this constant consolidation.
Yeah.
I've heard the many chains, and now they're all owned by like three companies. Uh,
Yeah, I
you
guess
know,
I think the era of Whole Foods snapping them all up appears to be over. It doesn't seem like Amazon wants to get into that, but that doesn't mean that the ones that are remaining are always doing great, and there are other entities, private equity, and things like that might salivate over them. And so, yeah, the consolidation problem continues.
yeah. I mean, we sold to Stop and Shop and Hannaford's, and they're both owned by Ahold now, which is a Dutch multinational. And they also own Giant down more your way, and they
Yeah,
also own Fresh Direct in New York City. So it's just amazing to see this happen. And there's always a change in the culture of the company, usually about 3 years after they get bought. And all of a
yeah,
sudden, price becomes a lot more important in the conversation.
yeah. And you get shareholders or maybe Jeff Bezos himself saying, "Why are we doing this? This isn't maximum." Just going down a list like, why are we buying this stuff? Why are we paying this price when we could be getting this other price? And yeah, this transformation happens.
So let me ask you, you certainly have read Michael Grunwald's article, Sorry, but This is the Future of Food.
Oh
Um,
yeah. In fact, I'm working on a review of his book right now.
great, great. Well, he seemed to me to be the anti-Joan. I mean, what he is proposing seems like almost diametrical opposite of what Joan Gussow was promoting. Could you describe his vision and her vision and kind of how do these contrast and what do you think they
Yeah.
mean for us?
Unfortunately, I can describe them in all too great a detail because I've been grappling with his text. And you know, just before we got on this call, I was working on the section of the review where he basically really centers yield, crop yield. And I'm guessing I'm talking to enough of a nerdy audience where I don't have to go into a lot of detail about that. As really the be all end all of agriculture. That is what the whole book is about. And he has this statement in the book that, if you don't mind, I can actually read to you, where he makes this point that I think is fundamental to where he goes wrong. And once again, it's at the very center of the book, and he talks about the Green Revolution, the sort of Norman Borlaug U.S. Foundation funded effort to bring industrial agriculture to the global South. Most famously in India, although it started in Mexico, and and so he says in the book very early on, sort of setting the stage, that the Green Revolution and its innovations saved billions of acres of land throughout the United States or throughout the world from agriculture by ramping up yields in India and other places in Asia and Latin America. Because they had these big yield gains, he says billions of acres were saved, and and it turns out that it's actually not true that ramping up yields leads to farmland being saved, because when you ramp up yields, what one thing that happens is that someone's going to get the idea that if you can get this bin busting amount of wheat from this piece of land, let me expand into this piece of land and do the same thing. And I was just looking at a report from some researchers from CGI IAR, which is this Green Revolution institution. It sort of grew out of the Green Revolution. It's this global network of ag researchers, and they did a big paper in 2013 that said that at most the Green Revolution saved 65 million acres. And I'm not a math whiz, but 65 million is a lot less than billions. In fact, it's orders of magnitude less. And that's the entire premise of his book. That if we ramp up yields, then we're going to spare all this land, and this land can all go and all quote unquote be rewild and sequester carbon that way. And that's just not how it works. And then the other big problem, and this is where we get into Joan Gussow world, is that he's operating under this idea that you can basically separate human activity from quote unquote nature. That we humans are here and nature is here. And so if we sort of take our agriculture and confine it into the smallest space as possible, then we can contain all of the problems it creates and rewild the rest of it. But it turns out that that's impossible. That when you try to contain agriculture, like I said, I'm just working on a piece about how in Iowa, basically industrial agriculture has polluted the water to such an extent that it looks like it's one of the causes for Iowa having a big cancer crisis. That the pollution from this kind of farming, you can't keep it out of the water supply, and it's getting into people's bodies and triggering an upswing in cancer. And then obviously these excess nutrients and things like that, nitrate and phosphorus, makes its way down to the Gulf of Mexico and causes this giant dead zone every year. These are just examples of how it's a fantasy that you can contain this kind of agriculture. And another example that terrifies me is, he really loves the feedlot, the sort of CAFO model of growing meat. So we confine meat into these tiny spaces, these tiny barns. We concentrate the barns in places like Iowa and North Carolina. And by doing that, we sort of keep it away from, cities. We just sort of minimize the amount of ground that it takes. Well, one of the problems of that obviously is the corn and the soybeans that needed to keep that system going cause all the problems I'm just talking about with nitrates. The other thing is that when you concentrate the same species of animal with the same genetics that deeply, that intensively, what you're doing is you're creating the perfect conditions for pathogens to develop and mutate in a way that are novel to our immune systems. And we saw in 2009, there was a swine flu outbreak that started down in Mexico in a U.S.-owned industrial hog facility that combined bird flus with human flus and escaped into the human population and created a global pandemic. And it didn't turn out to be that bad because the strain that it created wasn't very virulent, and so it didn't cause that many deaths. But I've talked to scientists in my reporting that say it's basically a numbers game. You are creating these opportunities, and at some point in the next generation, there's probably going to be a pathogen that's created in these facilities that jumps out into the population that is our immune systems are naive to, that could cause another global pandemic. And we saw in the last global pandemic that we're just not prepared for that. Our society doesn't handle that kind of risk very well. And so, I go through other examples in this review of it's a fantasy that you can contain this stuff. When you contain it, you generate the kinds of problems that don't stay in place, that move around, that cause all kinds of problems everywhere. And that's something that, we've been talking about Joan's legacy. She was, she intimately knew that people are part of nature, that we have to behave like we're part of nature. We have to farm like we're part of nature. and we can't be sort of like way over applying nutrients and expecting them not to cause all kinds of trouble. And so, that for me is really the sort of fundamental fantasy that, he builds his argument on, that we need more industrialization of agriculture. That, A, that you can contain it, and B, that by ramping up yields, that we're somehow magically going to save all of this land from the plow.
Yeah. This was also the kind of theme of that article in Nature, which said that um, organic farming is worse for climate than heavy use chemical farming because the yields are lower per acre and
Exactly. Yeah.
that equation. And I thought that's got to be so insane. That can't be right. Um, you can't create an unhealthy system to try and create to be the cure to an unhealthy system. Um,
Yeah.
it didn't make sense, but it was the head of a department at an Ivy League college who told me that, and he was quite convinced. He said, "Well, of course, organic farming is bad for the climate," and I was like, "What?"
Yeah, and it's completely based on this yield idea, and what they don't, there's a thing called the rebound effect. Like, you increase yield by 10%, and there's more opportunity. And a really great example of that happening is Brazil has emerged as the other epicenter of global industrial agriculture. It's the rival of the Corn Belt, the Brazilian savanna. And they've seen these huge gains in yields over the past basically half century, same period we're talking about. And has it spared any land in the savanna? No. In fact, the savanna continues to be going to the plow for industrial agriculture because it produces very high yields. And so it's just, it doesn't make sense on its own terms, because it's actually not sparing land.
Yeah,
Like, your
yeah,
professor at this Ivy League college, if the 20% whatever yield penalty that organic has, whatever it is, I know it's extremely variable and it just really depends. But if that 20% meant that there was 20%, it was translating to saving land, then there might be something to grapple with in the argument, but it's not. So, what are the other outputs? What does the water look like coming out of this conventional system? What does the air look like coming out of this conventional system? Now we're seeing significantly worse outputs.
yeah.
And so, basically, like, on the climate front, it seems to me that this argument between organic and conventional that these papers are trying to foment is looking at the wrong question. The question is, what sort of diet should we have, and what diet would lead to a smaller footprint? And I think it's clear that this sort of feedlot model of where everyone eats, whatever it is. I'm forgetting what the per capita U.S. meat consumption is, but it's one of the very, very highest in the world, and it's based on this incredibly land-intensive system of growing lots and lots and lots of corn and soybeans, and cutting the amount of meat that we eat down, and bringing animals back outside, in a place like the Corn Belt. But everyone eating less meat but better meat, it seems like an obvious climate winner.
Okay, so question, agriculture and food seem incredibly difficult to change and to change the system in a positive way. I won't say it's impossible to change because I think the big companies have changed it and pretty radically, but it's been a hard thing to regulate. Do you have any thoughts about how we citizens address that issue?
Yeah, I mean, that is the really, really big question. And there were a few days in 2020, or was it 2019? Yeah, 2019, early 2020, before the pandemic hit, just before the pandemic hit, in fact, when I did have some hope, because if you look at the agriculture platform of Bernie Sanders, incredibly progressive, definitely calling on a crackdown on the CAFO model, definitely calling on reining in the power of the 4 and 5 corporations that control seeds and pesticides and meat packing, in all these various fields, just a few companies, fertilizers dominate these markets. Um, Definitely calling for a huge overhaul of the Farm Bill. Um, it was incredibly popular, even in Iowa. So, in the Iowa primary, the Iowa caucus of 2019, I think early 2020, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren came in 2 and 3, actually 1 and 3, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg was right in there. But both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren had these incredibly progressive agriculture platforms that, according to conventional wisdom, you can't go into Iowa and say, I'm cracking down on CAFOs. I want to diversify away from just corn and soybeans. But they did exactly just that, and they combined for 45% of the delegates. Joe Biden, who picked Tom Vilsack to run his campaign in Iowa, a very conventional ag guy who said we can't challenge the corporations, they're too powerful in Iowa, just don't talk about it. He got like 13 or 14% of the delegates. So this resonated. And well, you can say, Tom, that was just in the Iowa like Democratic caucus. But let's go back to 2008. Barack Obama, running in 2008, explicitly called on a crackdown on CAFOs in Iowa, explicitly talked about raising water and air quality standards from CAFOs. And he surprisingly won the Iowa caucuses. And then he actually won the general election. And I think he carried it in 2012 as well. So I do think that, as horrible as things look right now, and as regressive as Donald Trump's USDA is and EPA is on these questions, despite the brouhaha around RFK Jr., who has proven to be a paper tiger on these issues, doesn't seem to care very much about them now that the rubber has hit the road in his tenure at HHS. Even though we're in this really dark time, I do think that a party that makes these issues paramount and communicates them well can do well in national. I think there's a constituency out there. I think they make sense to people. And I think that we can have this in the future, but it is going to take electing better politicians. And I think even the success of Maha, as much as it drives me crazy, it showed that there is this constituency out there. And there are a lot of angry people right now who are mad that the administration isn't taking on pesticides and isn't taking on chemicals and is gutting the EPA as we speak. Um, but that energy can be galvanized, hopefully by politicians that don't have fascistic tendencies.
Yeah.
Hopefully the Democrats can sort of see what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren did in 2020 in the Corn Belt, and translate it into some kind of message that takes that energy and pushes it in progressive directions. But I do think it is a winning issue, and I think it's a winning issue even in places like Iowa, potentially. I mean, there's other cultural issues in Iowa that don't make it rise to the top, but I think that this idea that you can't walk into Iowa and talk like this is wrong, and we've seen that demonstrated multiple times.
Yeah. 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 Unfortunately, for Obama, of course. Vilsack was his Secretary of Agriculture,
Oh,
and
I
I
know.
believe it.
I mean, you can Google my despairing article I wrote in either 2007 or 2008. As soon as he made that decision, because remember that Michael Pollan had written a thing called Farmer in Chief in the New York Times Magazine that one heard that Obama read it, and it was laying out this new vision how Obama could be this transformative president. And I think it was after the election before he took over. And that was one of these moments like, wow, things are changing. We've got, the ear of the White House. And then, this cold hand comes down with the choice of Vilsack. And Vilsack, he governed as you would expect from his past. He was very open to industrial agriculture. He paid nice lip service to organic, but Vilsack kind of represents the vision of sort of, what do they call it? All of the above. Like, hey, if you want organic, you should be able to go into a grocery store and get organic. But the main way that we're going to grow food is with these industrial practices. And that's what we have now. Like, I can go to Harris Teeter in Baltimore and say this organic section, but it's not real organic. It's industrial organic produced by many of the same firms that do the conventional stuff. And that is we are living in Vilsack's world, and it's terrible.
Yeah, yeah. So you said that Maha drives you crazy. Can I ask why? Have you got words for that?
Yeah, because it comes out of someone like RFK Jr. So RFK Jr. I know his work at waterkeepers and with river keepers in a place like North Carolina. They were an important force for exposing the harms of industrial hog production on largely African American rural communities in North Carolina. They did a lot of important work. And so that's one part of his legacy. Another part of his legacy is this anti-vaccine stuff, which he has done a lot of verbal gymnastics around and played both sides against the middle. And and so these are the sort of twin legacies that he brought into when he went MAGA and accepted, threw his weight behind Trump in the 2024 election. He, you know, basically talked more about ultra processed foods and food dye and things like that, and just sort of like let the vaccine thing kind of like hang out there. But he galvanizes a lot of energy around this idea of make America healthy again, and these ultra processed foods. And Donald Trump says late in the election, I'm going to let him go wild on, I think he said health. I'm going to let him go wild on health, but he's not going to get anywhere near fossil fuels. And I think that was a signal of what was going to come. And so what ends up happening is he gets all this energy. And what really drove me crazy about it was the Democrats should have had that energy. The Democrats should have had that. They should have been making those points. They should have, someone like Cory Booker should have been the Democrats' ag policy arm and should have been galvanizing energy around that. Although that was really hard to do for someone like Kamala Harris because she was running on this Biden is great, I'm not changing anything from what Biden did. And that sort of saddled her with this sort of Vilsackian reality of, oh, we're not going to talk very much about that. We can't take on, we'll get killed in the Midwest if we take on ag. So the Democrats are silent on it. Kennedy drums up all this energy around it. The election happens. Trump wins very narrowly and names Kennedy head of HHS, Health and Human Services. His portfolio has he's over the FDA, but he's got no part of his portfolio is about ag policy or about chemical policy, except for chemicals as they might show up in food. And he gets into power, and what does he do? What he ends up doing is pushing the craziest part of his agenda, which is the anti-vax stuff, and basically abandoning the food and agriculture part of it. And he can have the excuse of, well, I'm not over that. They didn't give me USDA, but he's not using his bully pulpit for it. What he's doing is he's making a big deal about things like food dyes, which I agree should come out of the food system. And he's getting these voluntary agreements with these companies that probably mean about as much as these commitments to buy local that we saw, 10 or 15 years ago. So he's doing that. He's, basically undermining vaccination, the sort of U.S. vaccination system, which I think is going to be a public health disaster. And then meanwhile, he's completely de-emphasizing chemicals in agriculture. And, I was just looking at this. There's this effort. It turns out that the EPA regulates nitrate in water at 10 parts per million and has been doing this since the early 1990s. And it turns out that there's a lot of harms from chronic exposure to nitrates at way lower levels, at 5 and 6 parts per million. And so the EPA was in the process of reviewing the standard and maybe going to change it. So in 2017, Trump ended the process. Biden restarts it. So EPA is back to looking at this, in this long, deliberative way. And so what does Trump do in 2025? He guts the part of the department within EPA that is overseeing this process. Completely guts it, fires everyone in it, guts the EPA's ability to do that. And do we get anything from Kennedy about this? Do we get any public or any reported pushback on this? Not a bit. And so this standard of 10 parts per million is going to be around indefinitely. That same the EPA agencies that regulate drinking water have not added a new chemical to the regulated chemicals in many, many years. And Kennedy doesn't seem, suddenly he's gone silent on this issue. And I think he's preserved the status quo on food and agriculture, or, the administration has, and he has not said anything about it. I mean, your listeners know what a catastrophe the Great Big Beautiful Bill was, right? It guts food aid and adds to the worst agricultural subsidies in the Great Big Beautiful Bill. We get not a peep from Kennedy about this. No pushback. And so I just think, he's been a disaster. I think, from reading about him, he's probably a megalomaniac, and that's why he vibes with Trump so well. And so I have no respect for any of those people, including Kennedy. Even though I appreciate his work on CAFOs. Where is he on CAFOs? Where's the Trump administration on CAFOs? Not doing anything about it. They just canceled a grant this actually does tie directly to Kennedy. In the cuts in the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, they cut a big grant to sort of monitor air and water quality in Eastern North Carolina, CAFO country. And the reason why they cut it is because the people who live amid this filth are predominantly African American, and they cut it on the grounds that it was DEI. they cut a big grant to the University of North Carolina to study this stuff. And so that's the kind of thing that Kennedy's, you know, HHS is doing. And so I say to hell with it, kick the bums out, and let's get a Democratic Party that can get out from under the sort of the heel of big agribusiness.
Okay, can I just ask before we
That
leave the
that is my
subject?
rant on Maha.
No, I asked it. I asked it. I was curious what you'd say. Can I ask about sewage sludge and PFAS? Because that's something that's kind of finally broken through to people's awareness. And
Yeah,
it's my sense that actually the administration is backing off on regulating that as well.
yeah, that is my sense as well. Um, I am about to dive into that in my podcast, which is called Unconfined here at the CLF, here at the Center for Livable Future. We're going to actually interview a farmer from Maine about that very topic in about six
Which
weeks.
farmer?
You're going to make me have to dig into my computer, but
Oh, okay, okay, yeah.
I'm
I
sure
just
you know
interviewed.
him. He was an organic
Yeah,
farmer whose business was destroyed by PFAS
yeah.
contamination from sewage sludge, and he's now working for an NGO working against it. And I think he was a
Adam
character.
Mandel.
That's exactly who I'm talking to. And
Yeah, I just interviewed him, and it was the most moving interview I've ever done.
yeah,
He's and his wife, Johanna Davis. So they're amazing, two amazing people who had a really terrible thing happen to them, and
yeah,
they responded like the amazing people that they are. But it's a grim story, and they're very generous in being willing to share it with the world because it's so painful. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, I think it's
Okay.
just another example of things that could be happening if there was a real Maha kind of ethos in effect here. But I think it ends up being yet another bitter joke of our times.
Yeah. I saw a lot of people get very excited about Maha, and it is interesting in being the most bipartisan mini movement that I've seen. I just saw shocking people from Congress who were not the friends of organic farming, not the friends of environmental regulation, embracing Make America Healthy again. And I thought, well, okay, maybe something important is happening here, but it seems to have become theater, actually.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I agree with that sentiment. I remember, I guess it was during Kennedy's hearing, his congressional confirmation hearing, where all these Republican senators were telling him, I agree with you 100% on food, but I have this problem about vaccinations. And it's kind of, and that was stunning to see. I have not seen that in my time. In my time, those senators use industry talking points. We have the safest food supply in the world, the cheapest food supply in the world. And they all seem to abandon that. And that was amazing to see. But then that same crew of people, they go and pass the great big beautiful bill, which doubles down on the worst kind of agriculture. So,
yeah, yeah, that's right. All right. So, Tom, I wanted to talk about Perilous Bounty as well. So, your excellent book, which I've gone through twice and I'm not done. I'll go through it again at least once more. So maybe we'll have another conversation sometime to
I'd be
do
happy to
that.
do that. That would be great.
It's an important book, and people should read it. And you did an excellent job. It's so well researched, and it looks at these two different worlds, California and Iowa, and they're very different, but boy, they're haunted. And it really goes into why and what's wrong and what better would look like. Before we end, have you got any last words about Joan you'd like to share? That's what we
I
started.
mean, I think, it's been a few months since she died, and we go through the sort of grieving of the loss But now I'm just at the point of the celebration of the life, just how much life she had, how much just joy and effervescence that she brought to her work, that she brought to the people around her. And I can just, as we talk about her, I can just see her. And I met her 5 or 6 times and got to hang out with her 5 or 6 times over those years. And I can just picture her so vividly laughing, telling a story, and just bringing so much wisdom. And the outpouring of appreciation that we've seen since her death just reminds us that, she's not with us here on earth anymore, but her memory, her example, her legacy is with us as long as the people who are still alive around her are alive. And I think if we're able to have a fraction of her influence, then it'll go down generations. And we're recording this a few days after Fred Kirschman died. He died very recently as we record this. And what I said about him in the CLF memorial that we did for him also applies to Joan. And that is that if we're in another 50, we've been talking about 50 years, if in another 50 years we have a robust food system, despite all these coming climate insults and the terrible politics that we're in right now, if we have a robust food system that creates healthy food for everyone in 50 years, it'll be because policymakers finally got wise to what Fred and Joan and that generation of people spent the decades and decades of their lives trying to get across. And so that's their legacy, is that their work, their influence is the hope that we carry forward over these next 50 years.
Yeah. All right. Tom Philpott, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. If you have a spare minute today, the single most effective way you can help us grow this movement and others to find this podcast is by leaving us a rating and a review wherever you listen to our podcast. You can find a video version of this interview on our website or on our YouTube channel, and you can join us every Sunday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. And if you haven't already, please sign up for our weekly newsletter at realorganicproject.org/email. See you next time.